Jamal helped an elderly man find shelter during a dangerous storm. He refused any reward, giving up his own umbrella and raincoat. The next morning, a luxury car pulled up to his house, bringing news that would change his family's life forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Jamal Washington's worn sneakers splashed through puddles as he hurried down Martin Luther King Boulevard, the early evening sky growing darker with each passing minute. Storm clouds loomed overhead, threatening to unleash their fury on the already wet streets of East Side Chicago. The weather forecast had warned about this one. They were calling it the worst storm system to hit the city in decades. He paused for a moment, looking up at the gathering darkness. The wind was picking up, whipping at his thin raincoat, making the empty storefront signs creak and swing. Some shops were already boarding up their windows, preparing for what was coming. The nice parts of town probably had their emergency generators ready, their pantries stocked. Here in his neighborhood, people just had to hope for the best. Jamal adjusted his backpack, heavy with books from the library where he'd been studying. At 16, he was already thinking about college, about getting out, about making something of himself. His teachers said he had potential, especially in science and engineering. But potential didn't pay bills, and right now, that's what his family needed most. Their small apartment above Mrs. Chen's convenience store wasn't much, but it was home. Ever since his father's construction accident 2 years ago, things had been tight. His mom worked double shifts at the hospital as a nurse's aide, and his dad did what he could from his wheelchair, fixing small appliances for neighbors to earn extra cash. Jamal had learned everything he knew about electronics and repairs from watching his father work, those careful hands still steady, even after everything that had happened. Thunder rumbled overhead as Jamal approached the intersection. The streetlight flickered, threatening to go out. He could see other people hurrying home, clutching groceries, holding newspapers over their heads, trying to beat the storm. The first heavy drops began to fall, and Jamal pulled his raincoat tighter. That's when he saw him. An elderly white man stood at the bus stop, looking confused and increasingly anxious as the wind grew stronger. He wore an expensive-looking suit that seemed out of place in this neighborhood, and he kept checking his phone, though cell service was already getting spotty with the approaching storm. The man's thin jacket offered little protection, and he was shivering. Jamal hesitated. His mom's voice echoed in his head, warning him about talking to strangers, especially in their neighborhood. But another voice, his father's this time, reminded him of something else. "We help people when they need it, son. That's what makes us human." The first real gust of wind hit then, strong enough to knock over the trash can next to the bus stop. The old man stumbled, barely keeping his balance. Without thinking further, Jamal rushed forward, grabbing the man's arm to steady him. "Sir, are you okay?" Jamal called out over the rising wind. The buses stopped running early because of the storm. They announced it an hour ago. The man's face, lined with age and worry, turned to Jamal with surprise. "They've stopped, but I need to get back to the north side. My driver dropped me off after a meeting, and I thought—" His voice trailed off as another thunderclap boomed overhead closer, this time. Jamal looked around quickly. The rain was coming down harder now, and the wind was getting dangerous. Debris was starting to blow down the street. Loose papers, small branches, anything not tied down. They needed to get inside and fast. "Listen, sir," Jamal said, making a quick decision. "My place is just 2 blocks from here. We can wait out the worst of it there. It's not safe to be out in this." The man hesitated, looking at Jamal with uncertainty. Jamal knew what he was seeing, a black teenager in a worn raincoat in a neighborhood that probably made him nervous. But another gust of wind made the decision for them as the rain turned sideways, stinging their faces. "Please, sir," Jamal insisted, already shrugging off his raincoat to offer it to the man. "The storm's going to get worse before it gets better. You can trust me." The elderly man looked at the raincoat in Jamal's outstretched hand, then back at the teenager's face. Something in Jamal's expression must have convinced him, because he nodded slowly, accepting the offered protection. "Thank you, young man. I'm Mr. Harrison," he said, his voice carrying a slight tremor. Whether from cold or nervousness, Jamal couldn't tell. They made their way through the intensifying storm, Jamal leading the way while keeping a steadying hand near Mr. Harrison's elbow. The wind howled through the streets, transforming the familiar neighborhood into something almost unrecognizable. Shop signs creaked ominously overhead, and the few remaining people on the street had disappeared entirely. As they approached Mrs. Chen's store, Jamal could see the familiar warm light still glowing through the windows. The old neon open sign buzzed and flickered, casting a red glow on the wet sidewalk. Through the glass, he could make out Mrs. Chen herself, hurriedly moving items away from the windows. "Almost there," Jamal assured Mr. Harrison, raising his voice over another crash of thunder. They climbed the side stairs leading to the apartment, Jamal fishing his keys from his pocket with slightly shaking hands. The sound of the storm seemed to fade slightly as they entered the narrow stairwell, replaced by the familiar smell of his mother's cooking wafting down from above. When they reached the apartment door, Jamal's father's voice carried through, deep and warm despite everything. "That you, Jay?" "Yeah, Dad," Jamal called back, helping Mr. Harrison inside. "I brought someone who got stuck in the storm." Their small living room was lit by several emergency lanterns. His father always kept them ready, a habit from his construction days. David Washington sat in his wheelchair near the window, various electronic parts spread out on the small table in front of him. He looked up as they entered, his eyes taking in the scene, his son soaking wet, and the elderly white man in Jamal's raincoat. "Welcome," David said, wheeling himself forward. "I'm David Washington, Jamal's father." His voice was warm but carried that quiet strength Jamal had always admired, the same strength that had kept him going after the accident. "Richard Harrison," the elderly man responded, seeming to relax slightly in the warm, dry room. "Your son, he probably saved my life out there. The storm ... The buses stopped running," Jamal explained, heading to the small closet to grab some towels. "Mr. Harrison was stuck at the stop on Martin Luther King." His father nodded, understanding, gesturing toward their worn but comfortable couch. "Please sit. My wife Sarah will be home soon. She's finishing her shift at the hospital. The storm's making everything chaos there, I'm sure." Mr. Harrison sat down, accepting the towel Jamal offered. His eyes moved around the small apartment, taking in the family photos on the walls, the shelf full of books, and the collection of tools and electronic equipment near David's workspace. "You repair things?" he asked, nodding toward the dismantled radio on the table. "Whatever needs fixing," David replied with a slight smile. "These days it's mostly small electronics, appliances, before—" He gestured to his wheelchair. "I worked construction, 20 years building this city's skyline. Now I help keep the neighborhood running in my own way." Jamal moved to the kitchen, putting on water for tea, listening to his father talk. He remembered those days clearly, watching his dad come home covered in dust but proud, teaching Jamal about tools and machines whenever he could. The accident had changed everything, but it hadn't broken his father's spirit or his desire to help others. "Jay's got the touch for it too," his father continued, pride evident in his voice. "Better than me sometimes, especially with the newer technology. He can look at something broken and just see how to make it work again." "Dad," Jamal protested softly, returning with mugs of hot tea. "It's true," David insisted. "He's got a gift. His teachers say he could be an engineer someday if we can figure out the college situation." There was a slight catch in his voice at that last part, one that made Jamal's chest tighten. The storm raged outside their windows, but inside the atmosphere had grown warmer, more comfortable. Mr. Harrison sipped his tea, his eyes moving between father and son with an expression Jamal couldn't quite read. "An engineer?" Mr. Harrison asked, his tone careful. "That's an admirable goal." "Yes, sir," Jamal replied, sitting down near his father's wheelchair. "I want to build things that help people, like my dad did. Maybe design better safety systems for construction workers or more efficient medical equipment, something that makes a difference." David reached over, squeezing his son's shoulder. He will too. Somehow, we'll make it happen. The conviction in his voice was strong, even though they both knew the reality of their situation. The mounting medical bills, the cost of college applications, the seemingly impossible dream of tuition. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The storm continued to rage outside as Sarah Washington hurried up the stairs to their apartment, her nurse's aide uniform soaked despite the umbrella. When she opened the door and found her family sitting with an elderly white man in what appeared to be Jamal's raincoat, her eyes widened in surprise, but her professional warmth took over immediately. "Welcome," she said, quickly assessing the situation. "I'm Sarah, Jamal's mother." She moved efficiently around the small space, hanging up her wet coat and pulling her hair back from her face. "The hospital's in chaos with this storm. Power's out in half the building." Jamal watched his mother move through their home with the same grace she brought to everything. Even after a double shift, she carried herself with dignity, though he could see the exhaustion in her eyes. She disappeared briefly into the kitchen, returning with more hot tea and some leftover cornbread. "Mrs. Washington," Mr. Harrison began, "your son was kind enough to help me when the buses stopped running. I don't know what I would have done otherwise." Sarah smiled, but Jamal could see her quick glance at him, the subtle mixture of pride and concern that often crossed her face when he tried to help others. "That sounds like my Jamal," she said, sitting down finally. "Always trying to help, just like his father." The conversation flowed easier then, as the storm raged outside. Sarah shared stories from the hospital, careful ones that wouldn't worry anyone too much. But Jamal could read between the lines, the understaffing, the aging equipment, the constant struggle to provide care with limited resources. It was a story he knew well, one that played out every day in their neighborhood. Later that evening, after Mr. Harrison had dozed off on their couch, they'd insisted he stay until the storm passed. Jamal sat at the small kitchen table doing his homework. The physics problems were challenging, but he enjoyed them. They made sense in a way people sometimes didn't. His mother moved quietly around the kitchen, preparing for her early shift the next day. "Jay," she said softly, not wanting to wake their guest. "You know I'm proud of you for helping, but—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "You need to be careful. The world isn't always kind to young black men doing the right thing." Jamal looked up from his textbook, meeting his mother's concerned gaze. "I know, Mom, but I couldn't just leave him out there. The storm was getting bad." Sarah sighed, running a hand over her son's short hair. "I know, baby. Your heart's too big sometimes, just like your daddy's." She glanced toward the living room where David had fallen asleep in his wheelchair, his tools still scattered on the table beside him. Jamal followed her gaze, feeling that familiar ache in his chest. He remembered the day of the accident clearly, the phone call, the rush to the hospital, the doctors' faces as they explained about his father's spine. He'd been 14 then, old enough to understand what it meant for their family, young enough to still believe things would somehow work out. The rain drummed against the windows as Jamal turned back to his physics homework. The scholarship applications were piled next to his textbook, each one a possible ticket out, a chance to make something of himself. His latest report card showed all A's. He was doing everything right, everything they said he should do. But sometimes it felt like running up a down escalator, trying to reach something that kept moving further away. "Got another letter from MIT today," he said quietly, pulling the crisp envelope from his backpack. "They're interested in my application. Said my test scores were impressive." Sarah's face lit up for a moment before reality settled back in. They both knew what MIT cost, knew it might as well be $1 million for all they could afford it. But she smiled anyway, that brave smile that had gotten them through so many hard times. "That's wonderful, Jay. We'll figure something out, we always do." Jamal nodded, but his throat felt tight. He glanced at Mr. Harrison, still sleeping peacefully on their couch. The man's suit, even wrinkled from the storm, probably cost more than Jamal's entire wardrobe. His watch alone could probably pay for a semester of college. It wasn't fair, but Jamal pushed down the bitterness. His father always said that comparing yourself to others only led to unhappiness. Instead, he focused on the physics problem in front of him, losing himself in the elegant equations that described how the world worked. In physics, everything followed rules. Force equals mass times acceleration. Energy couldn't be created or destroyed. If only life were that predictable, that would be fair. Thunder crashed outside, and Mr. Harrison stirred slightly but didn't wake. Jamal's mother moved to check on him, adjusting the blanket they'd given him with the same gentle care she showed her patients at the hospital. Looking at her, Jamal felt a surge of determination. Somehow, he would find a way to make things better. He would become an engineer, design safer equipment, create things that helped people like his father. He just needed a chance, one opportunity to prove what he could do. The storm raged through the night, but by morning the sky had cleared to a brilliant blue. Jamal woke early, the sun streaming through his window. He could hear his mother in the kitchen, probably preparing for her morning shift, and his father's quiet voice talking to someone. Mr. Harrison must have been awake already. Making his way to the kitchen, Jamal found Mr. Harrison dressed in his now-dried suit, looking remarkably composed despite spending the night on their couch. He was engaged in an animated conversation with David about electric motors, of all things. Fascinating approach to the repair, Mr. Harrison was saying, examining one of David's fixed appliances. I've never seen someone bypass the circuit quite like that. Sometimes you have to improvise, David replied, his hands moving over the repaired toaster. Especially when people can't afford new parts, you learn to work with what you have. Mr. Harrison nodded thoughtfully, then looked up as Jamal entered. Ah, there's my savior from the storm, he said, smiling warmly. I was just telling your father about a rather interesting problem we're having at my company. Perhaps you might have some thoughts on it. Jamal accepted a cup of coffee from his mother, raising his eyebrows questioningly. Your company, sir? Yes, Mr. Harrison said, reaching into his suit pocket and pulling out a business card. Harrison Technologies. We specialize in medical equipment and safety systems. He handed the card to Jamal, who took it carefully, his heart suddenly beating faster as he read the elegant text. Richard Harrison, CEO and founder. Sarah, who had been quietly preparing breakfast, stopped what she was doing, her eyes widening slightly. Jamal could feel the sudden shift in the room's energy, the realization of exactly who they had sheltered from the storm. You know, Mr. Harrison continued, seemingly oblivious to their reaction, we've been working on a new type of safety harness for construction workers, something that could prevent falls like. He glanced at David's wheelchair, then quickly away. Well, we've hit some technical roadblocks. The current design is too cumbersome. Workers complain it slows them down. We need fresh eyes on the problem. Jamal sat down slowly, his mind already racing with possibilities. Have you considered using lightweight composite materials? He asked, unable to help himself. Something that could distribute the force of impact while maintaining flexibility? Mr. Harrison's eyebrows shot up, and he leaned forward with interest. Go on. Well, Jamal continued, growing more animated. I've been reading about new carbon fiber compounds in my physics class. They're incredibly strong but flexible, if you designed the harness to use tension distribution like a spider's web. He grabbed a piece of paper from the counter and began sketching quickly, his hands moving with confidence as he outlined his idea. David wheeled closer, looking over his son's shoulder. See what I mean about him having the touch? He said proudly. He sees solutions where others see problems. Mr. Harrison studied the rough sketch, his expression growing more intrigued by the moment. This is, quite innovative, he said slowly. Very different from what our engineers have proposed. Simple, but elegant. He looked up at Jamal with new interest. Would you be willing to come to my office today? I'd like you to share these ideas with our development team." Jamal glanced at his parents. It was Saturday, no school, but his mother looked concerned. "I don't know," she began. "It's quite a distance to the north side." "I'll send a car," Mr. Harrison said quickly. "And of course, I'd like both you and your husband to come as well. There are some other matters I'd like to discuss." He paused, looking at David. "Including your insights on equipment repair. We're always looking for consultants with real-world experience." The room fell quiet for a moment. The only sound was the gentle humming of the refrigerator. Jamal could feel the weight of possibility in the air, heavy and electric like the storm the night before. This was either the opportunity of a lifetime or... He pushed away the doubt. His father always said that opportunity knocked quietly, and you had to be brave enough to answer. "We'd be honored," David said finally, his voice steady. Sarah nodded, though Jamal could see she was gripping the kitchen counter tightly, perhaps to hide the trembling of her hands. "Excellent." Mr. Harrison stood, straightening his tie. "I'll have my driver here in an hour. And Jamal," he turned to face him directly, "bring your college applications. I have a feeling we'll have quite a lot to discuss." True to his word, exactly 1 hour later, a sleek black Mercedes pulled up outside Mrs. Chen's store. The entire neighborhood seemed to stop and stare. Such cars were rarely seen on their street, and never stopping. Mrs. Chen herself came out of her store, pretending to sweep the sidewalk while stealing curious glances at the vehicle. The Washingtons had gotten ready as best they could. Sarah had changed out of her nurse's aide uniform into her church dress, the one she saved for special occasions. David had put on a clean shirt and tried to tame his graying hair. Jamal wore his best clothes, which meant his least worn jeans and the button-up shirt he usually saved for school presentations. As they prepared to leave, Jamal noticed his father struggling slightly with the wheelchair on their building's old, uneven steps. Without hesitation, he moved to help. But Mr. Harrison's driver was already there, professionally assisting. The man introduced himself as Marcus, handling the wheelchair with practiced ease that spoke of experience. "My brother was in a chair," Marcus explained quietly to Jamal as they worked together to secure the wheelchair in the specially equipped car. "You learn the right ways to help." The car's interior was more luxurious than anything Jamal had ever seen, with soft leather seats and what looked like a small computer built into the armrest. But what caught his attention was the stack of folders Mr. Harrison had brought with him, labeled with the Harrison Technologies logo. As they drove through the city, watching the neighborhoods gradually transform from run-down buildings to gleaming skyscrapers, Mr. Harrison opened one of the folders. "Before we reached the office, I wanted to show you something, Jamal. These are the accident reports from construction sites over the past 5 years. Jamal leaned forward, looking at the statistics. His father also peered at the papers, his expression growing serious. The numbers were staggering. Hundreds of injuries, dozens of accidents similar to the one that had changed their lives forever. "Each one of these represents a family like yours," Mr. Harrison said softly. "Workers who were just trying to do their jobs, to provide for their loved ones. That's why this new safety system is so important. It's not just about profits or regulations. It's about people." Sarah reached over and squeezed David's hand, and Jamal could see his father's eyes growing misty. The car fell silent as they all absorbed the weight of those numbers. Those lives changed forever. When they arrived at the Harrison Technologies building, Jamal couldn't help but stare. The structure seemed to be made entirely of glass and steel, rising into the sky like something from a science fiction movie. The lobby was equally impressive, with a massive digital display showing various Harrison Technologies innovations. As they made their way to the elevator, Mr. Harrison's assistant met them, carrying more folders and speaking rapidly about the development team waiting upstairs. But before they could proceed, Jamal noticed an elderly custodian struggling with a malfunctioning floor cleaning machine near the lobby's corner. Without thinking, Jamal stepped away from the group. "Excuse me for a moment," he said, already moving toward the custodian. He could hear Mr. Harrison's assistant making a small sound of protest, but he ignored it. "Can I help?" Jamal asked the custodian, who looked up in surprise. The man's name tag read Earl, and his hands were shaking slightly as he tried to figure out what was wrong with the machine. It just stopped working, Earl explained, his voice frustrated. And they're expecting some big shots up in the conference room soon. Jamal knelt down, examining the machine. It was a newer model, but the basic principles were the same as the ones he'd helped his father fix. Mind if I take a look? Earl gestured helplessly, and Jamal got to work. His fingers moved surely over the machinery, finding the issue quickly. A simple blocked filter and a loose connection. Within minutes, the machine was humming smoothly again. There you go, Jamal said, standing up and wiping his hands on his jeans before realizing he might have just ruined his best pair. Just make sure to clean the filter more regularly and check these connections here and here. Earl's face broke into a relieved smile. Thank you, son. You've saved my morning. When Jamal turned back to the group, he found Mr. Harrison watching him with an unreadable expression. His mother looked slightly mortified that he'd gotten his clothes dirty right before the meeting, but his father was smiling proudly. I'm sorry, Jamal said, suddenly aware that he might have committed some terrible corporate faux pas. I just saw he needed help. Mr. Harrison held up a hand, stopping his apology. Don't be sorry, he said, his voice firm. That right there, that instinct to help, to fix what's broken without being asked or expecting anything in return, that's exactly why I wanted you here today. The elevator doors opened, and as they stepped inside, Mr. Harrison added quietly, You know, I started this company fixing machines in my garage. Everyone needs someone who can see what's broken and know how to make it right. The elevator ride to the top floor of Harrison Technologies was silent, but charged with anticipation. Jamal watched the floor numbers climb higher and higher, his heart beating faster with each passing digit. The entire elevator was glass, giving them a view of the city that grew more spectacular as they ascended. He could see his neighborhood in the distance, looking small and far away from this height. When they reached the executive floor, they were led into a large conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows. A team of engineers was already waiting, their expressions curious as they took in the unusual group. A teenager in slightly dirty jeans, a man in a wheelchair, and a woman in her Sunday best. Everyone, Mr. Harrison announced, his voice carrying natural authority. This is Jamal Washington and his family. Jamal has some ideas about our safety harness problem that I think you'll want to hear. He turned to Jamal, nodding encouragingly. The floor is yours, young man. Jamal swallowed hard, looking at the expectant faces around the table. These were professional engineers, people with degrees and years of experience. But then he felt his father's hand on his arm, giving him a reassuring squeeze, and he remembered all the times they'd worked together, solving problems that others had given up on. Taking a deep breath, he moved to the whiteboard that covered one wall. The current safety harness design has 3 main issues, he began, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. It's too heavy, it restricts movement, and it's uncomfortable enough that workers often don't wear it properly. He began drawing, his markers squeaking against the board as he outlined his idea. The spider web concept he'd sketched in his kitchen now took fuller form, enhanced by everything he'd learned from his physics classes and his father's practical knowledge. If we use carbon fiber composites here, here, and here, he explained, marking the key points, we can create a flexible support structure that distributes force evenly across the body. The key is to work with natural movement patterns rather than against them. One of the engineers, a woman with gray-streaked hair, leaned forward. But the cost of carbon fiber, can be offset, Jamal interrupted, then caught himself. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. No, go on, Mr. Harrison encouraged. How would you offset the cost? By reducing the complexity of the manufacturing process, Jamal continued, gaining confidence. Look at these connection points. The current design uses 15 separate pieces. We could achieve the same strength with 7 using this interlocking pattern. He drew quickly, showing the simplified design. Less assembly time, fewer points of potential failure, and lower manufacturing costs. The room had grown very quiet. Jamal could see the engineers exchanging glances, some skeptical, others intrigued. His mother sat very straight in her chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. His father's eyes never left him, filled with a pride that made Jamal's throat tight. "And this knowledge of manufacturing processes comes from?" one of the engineers asked, his tone slightly condescending. "From watching things break and figuring out how to fix them when people can't afford replacements?" Jamal replied honestly. "From learning that sometimes the simplest solution is the best one, especially when lives depend on it." He glanced at his father, then back at the engineer. "When you can't buy new parts, you learn to understand exactly how things work, down to the smallest detail." Mr. Harrison stood up, moving to stand beside Jamal at the whiteboard. "What I see here," he said, addressing his team, "is exactly the kind of innovative thinking we've been missing. We've been approaching this from an engineering perspective only, forgetting the human element." He turned to Jamal. "Would you be interested in developing this further? As an intern?" Jamal's heart leaped, but he managed to keep his voice steady. "Yes, sir, I would." "Good. Because I think this could be the breakthrough we've been looking for." Mr. Harrison turned to the team. "I want a prototype based on this design within 2 weeks. Jamal will consult on the development." He paused, looking at David. "And I'd like your father's input as well, if he's willing. We need someone who understands the practical implications of what we're designing." David straightened in his wheelchair, his voice firm. "I'd be honored to help prevent other families from going through what we did." The meeting continued, with engineers asking questions and making suggestions. Jamal answered each one thoughtfully, his mind racing with possibilities. But through it all, he couldn't help thinking about what this meant. Not just the internship, but the chance to create something that could actually save lives. As the meeting wound down, Mr. Harrison pulled Jamal aside while the engineers were discussing technical details with his father. "You know," he said quietly, "most people, when they help a stranger in a storm, they're looking for something in return. But you didn't even tell me your name until I asked. Why?" Jamal thought about it for a moment. "Because it wasn't about getting anything back," he said finally. "It was just about helping someone who needed it. That's what my parents taught me." Mr. Harrison nodded slowly, a smile spreading across his face. "And that, Jamal Washington, is exactly why you're going to go far in this world." As the meeting concluded, Mr. Harrison's assistant entered the conference room with another stack of papers. "Sir, the MIT admissions officer is on line 1. She's asking about our scholarship program." Jamal's head snapped up at the mention of MIT, and he saw his mother's hand fly to her mouth. Mr. Harrison nodded to his assistant, then turned to address the room. "Would you all excuse us for a moment? I need to speak with the Washingtons privately." The engineers filed out, several of them pausing to shake Jamal's hand or pat him on the shoulder. Once the room was empty except for the family and Mr. Harrison, he gestured for them to stay seated. "Before I take this call," Mr. Harrison said, "I want to propose something." He pulled out a folder that had been sitting at the bottom of his stack all morning. "Jamal, your design today wasn't just impressive. It showed exactly the kind of thinking we need in this industry. But more than that, you demonstrated something rare, the ability to see beyond the immediate problem to the human cost behind it." He opened the folder, spreading out several documents on the conference table. "Harrison Technologies has a scholarship program for promising young engineers, full ride to any university of choice, plus a guaranteed internship position during summers and after graduation." He paused, letting that sink in. "We typically announce these in the spring, but I'm prepared to make an early decision in your case." The room fell silent. Jamal could hear his own heartbeat, could feel his mother's hand gripping his arm so tight it almost hurt. His father had gone very still in his wheelchair. "However," Mr. Harrison continued, "I have a challenge for you first. Our development team is working on several other safety projects, not just construction equipment, but medical devices as well. I want you to review them over the next week. Look at them with fresh eyes, the way you looked at the harness problem. Show me that this morning wasn't a one-time flash of brilliance." He pushed the folder toward Jamal. "These are complex problems, Some of our best engineers have struggled with them. I want to see how you approach them, not just technically, but ethically. Remember, each one of these projects could affect thousands of lives. Jamal reached for the folder with slightly shaking hands. Inside were detailed technical specifications, prototype designs, and problem statements for various projects. His eyes widened as he scanned the first few pages. These were cutting-edge developments, the kind of projects he'd only read about in science magazines. "Sir," he began, his voice hesitant, "I'm honored, but these are really advanced. I'm just in high school." "You're also the young man who helped a stranger in a storm without expecting anything in return," Mr. Harrison interrupted. "The same young man who just took our biggest design challenge and found a solution we hadn't considered in months of trying. And the same young man who stopped everything to help a custodian fix his machine, even though you were on your way to an important meeting." He leaned forward, his expression serious. "Those actions tell me more about your potential than any test score or diploma ever could. Technical knowledge can be taught, Jamal. Character and insight like yours. That's something rare." Sarah spoke up, her voice trembling slightly. "Mr. Harrison, this is more than we could have ever hoped for. But we don't want charity." "This isn't charity, Mrs. Washington," Mr. Harrison said firmly. "This is an investment in talent. In fact," he smiled, glancing at David, "I'd like to discuss a consulting contract with your husband as well. His practical experience would be invaluable to our development team." David straightened in his wheelchair. "You're serious?" "Completely. The way you've adapted and repaired equipment, finding creative solutions with limited resources, that's exactly the kind of thinking we need. Too many of our engineers have never worked in the real world. They don't understand the practical implications of their designs." Jamal looked at his father, seeing the pride and hope battling with caution in his expression. They'd had disappointments before, promises that turned out to be empty, but something about Mr. Harrison felt different. "1 week," Mr. Harrison said, tapping the folder in front of Jamal. "Review these projects, think them through. Come back next Saturday with your analysis. Show me that you're ready for this opportunity." He stood, straightening his tie. "And now, if you'll excuse me, I have an admissions officer to speak with about reserving a spot for one of our scholarship recipients." As Mr. Harrison left the room, the Washingtons sat in stunned silence. Jamal opened the folder again, his mind already racing with ideas as he looked at the projects. His mother wiped tears from her eyes, and his father reached over to squeeze his shoulder. "Remember what I always told you, son," David said softly. "Opportunity knocks quietly. And you have to be brave enough to answer," Jamal finished, his voice thick with emotion. He looked at his parents, seeing all their sacrifices, all their love and support reflected in their faces. "I won't let you down. Either of you." The ride home was quieter than the journey to Harrison Technologies, each member of the Washington family lost in their own thoughts. The folder of projects sat in Jamal's lap, feeling heavier than its physical weight would suggest. Through the car's tinted windows, he watched the city landscape shift back from gleaming skyscrapers to familiar neighborhood streets. As they approached their building, Marcus, the driver, cleared his throat. "Mr. Harrison asked me to make sure you have my direct number," he said, handing Jamal a business card, "for your transportation to and from the office next week." And he hesitated, then continued. "My brother, the one in the wheelchair I mentioned, he works in IT at Harrison Technologies now. Mr. Harrison hired him when no one else would." Jamal exchanged glances with his father, both of them absorbing this new piece of information. Before they could respond, Marcus added, "There's something else Mr. Harrison wanted me to give you." He reached into the front compartment and pulled out a sleek laptop bag. He said, "You'll need this for reviewing the projects." Inside the bag, Jamal found a high-end laptop and tablet, both bearing the Harrison Technologies logo. A note attached read, "Tools of the trade. Put them to good use. R.H." As Marcus helped David with his wheelchair, Mrs. Chen came hurrying out of her store. Is everything okay? She asked, trying to hide her curiosity behind concern. Such a fancy car. Everything's fine, Mrs. Chen, Sarah assured her. But her voice carried a new confidence, a hint of pride she couldn't quite suppress. Jamal has an opportunity with Harrison Technologies. Mrs. Chen's eyes widened. The medical company? The one that makes the machines for our clinic? She turned to Jamal with newfound respect. Aya, no wonder you're so good at fixing my cash register. Once inside their apartment, Jamal set up the laptop on the kitchen table. His father wheeled over beside him as he opened the first project file. The screen displayed detailed schematics for a new type of portable dialysis machine, designed to be more accessible for low-income communities. Look at this, Dad, Jamal said, pointing to a particular component. They're trying to reduce the cost by simplifying the filtration system, but that could compromise its effectiveness, David finished, leaning closer to study the design. You know, this reminds me of something I saw at the VA hospital during my rehabilitation. They had a similar problem with their equipment. For the next few hours, father and son lost themselves in the technical challenges, their conversation flowing naturally between engineering principles and real-world applications. Sarah watched them from the kitchen as she prepared dinner. Her heart full at seeing them working together like this, reminded of the days before the accident, when they would tinker with machines in their small garage. The sound of a car pulling up outside drew their attention. Looking out the window, they saw Mr. Harrison himself stepping out of another sleek vehicle, this time carrying what appeared to be more files. I hope you don't mind the intrusion, he said when Sarah opened the door, but there's something I wanted to discuss with all of you. He paused in the doorway, taking in the scene of Jamal and David, already deep into the project files. Ah, I see you've started analyzing the designs. Mr. Harrison, Jamal began, I think we've found some potential issues with the dialysis machine project. I expected you might, Mr. Harrison said, pulling up a chair. But before we get into that, there's something you should know about why I'm really here. He placed a framed photograph on the table. The image showed a much younger version of himself standing next to an elderly black man in work clothes, both smiling in front of what looked like a small repair shop. This is James Carter, Mr. Harrison said softly. He owned the garage where I got my start. Back in 1975, my car broke down in his neighborhood during a thunderstorm. I was a young businessman, trying to make my way in the medical equipment industry. Nobody would give me the time of day because of my ideas about making medical technology more accessible. He touched the photograph gently. James not only fixed my car, but listened to my ideas. Gave me space in his garage to work on my first prototypes. Taught me about seeing the human side of technology. He looked up at the Washingtons. He changed my life, and I never got the chance to fully repay him before he passed away. The room was silent as Mr. Harrison continued. When you helped me in that storm, Jamal, it wasn't just about getting out of the rain. You reminded me of James. That same instinct to help, that same way of looking at problems and seeing solutions others miss. Mr. Harrison pulled out another document from his briefcase, laying it carefully on the table next to the photograph. This is something else I wanted to discuss with you. It's not just about the scholarship or the internship. He paused, making sure he had everyone's attention. I'm starting a new division at Harrison Technologies, one focused specifically on developing affordable medical and safety equipment for underserved communities. The fluorescent kitchen light hummed quietly overhead as Mr. Harrison continued. The projects you're looking at now? They're just the beginning. I want to create a team that understands both the technical challenges and the human impact of what we're developing. And I want you, Jamal, to be part of building it from the ground up. Sarah leaned forward in her chair, her nursing aide's badge still pinned to her collar from her earlier shift. What exactly are you saying, Mr. Harrison? I'm saying that this could be more than just a summer internship or a college scholarship. This could be the beginning of a career, a chance to make real change. He turned to David. And I want you involved too, Mr. Washington. Your experience, your practical knowledge, it's invaluable. The way you've adapted and repaired equipment with limited resources. That's exactly the kind of thinking we need. David's hands gripped his wheelchair's armrests tightly. But I'm not an engineer. I never even finished college. No, Mr. Harrison agreed. But you understand something many engineers don't. How these devices actually work in the real world. How people really use them. That's knowledge you can't get from a textbook. Jamal looked at the project files spread across their kitchen table, then at his father's tools hanging on the wall, and finally at the photograph of James Carter's garage. Everything seemed to be connecting, forming a picture he hadn't seen before. The new division, he said slowly. Would it be working on things like the safety harness? Equipment that could prevent accidents like... He glanced at his father's wheelchair. Exactly. Mr. Harrison nodded. But also medical devices that could make treatment more accessible to communities like yours. Dialysis machines that smaller clinics could afford. Portable diagnostic equipment that could reach rural areas. He leaned back in his chair. James always told me that technology should serve people, not the other way around. That's what this division would be about. Sarah wiped tears from her eyes, trying to maintain her composure. This seems too good to be true, she whispered. I understand your skepticism, Mr. Harrison said gently. But sometimes, Mrs. Washington, life has a way of bringing the right people together at the right moment, just like a storm forced me to stop at James Carter's garage all those years ago. He pulled out one more document, this one bearing the Harrison Technologies letterhead. This is a formal offer for David to join our team as a technical consultant, starting immediately. Full benefits, including comprehensive medical coverage. He placed it on the table next to the scholarship papers. And Jamal, once you've completed your engineering degree, there will be a position waiting for you in the new division. The room fell silent again, the weight of possibility hanging in the air. Through the window they could see the neighborhood where they'd struggled and survived for so long, where David had taught Jamal to fix things, where Sarah had worked double shifts to keep them afloat. Why? Jamal asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Why us? Mr. Harrison smiled, touching the photograph of James Carter again. Because sometimes the best way to honor those who helped us is to help others in turn. James Carter gave me a chance when no one else would. He saw potential where others saw problems. He looked at Jamal intently. Just like you saw someone who needed help in that storm, not just a stranger in an expensive suit. David reached over and took his son's hand, then his wife's, forming a circle around their small kitchen table. What do you think, son? He asked softly. Ready to build something new? Jamal looked at his parents' faces, seeing all their hopes and dreams reflected there. He thought about all the nights they'd spent trying to make broken things work, all the times his mother had come home exhausted from extra shifts, all the college brochures they'd looked at, knowing they couldn't afford them. Yes, he said finally, his voice growing stronger. Yes, I'm ready. The kitchen clock ticked steadily as the Washingtons and Mr. Harrison worked through the details of what would come next. Each moment seemed to carry the weight of their changing future, their small apartment becoming the birthplace of something extraordinary. First things first, Mr. Harrison said, pulling out a calendar. Jamal, I want you to spend your afternoons at the office working with our development team. We'll arrange transportation so it won't interfere with your school schedule. He turned to David. And we can set up a home office for you, Mr. Washington, with all the equipment you'll need. That way you can work remotely when needed. Sarah sat at the table, her hands wrapped around a cup of now cold coffee, her eyes moving between her son and husband as if seeing them in a new light. All those hours you two spent fixing things, she said softly. All those times I worried you were wasting your time on broken machines. I never imagined it would lead to this. David reached over and covered her hand with his. Remember what you used to tell me? That God doesn't give us burdens without giving us the strength to bear them? His voice cracked slightly. Maybe this is why. Maybe everything we've been through was leading us here. Mr. Harrison watched their interaction with a thoughtful expression. You know, he said, when I started Harrison Technologies, Everyone said I was crazy to focus on making medical equipment more accessible. They said there wasn't enough profit in it. He smiled, looking around their modest kitchen. But James Carter told me something I will never forget. He said, "The real profit is in knowing you've made someone's life better." Just then, the sound of excited voices drifted up from the street. Looking out the window, they could see a small crowd gathering around the sleek car parked outside. Mrs. Chen was there, gesturing animatedly as she talked to the neighbors. "Looks like the news is spreading," David chuckled. "In this neighborhood, a car like that staying this long. People are going to talk." Jamal felt a sudden surge of pride mixed with responsibility. In his community, where good news was often hard to come by, this wasn't just about him or his family anymore. This was about showing what was possible. "Mr. Harrison," he said, straightening in his chair, "those projects you gave me to review. I was thinking about the portable dialysis machine. What if we designed it to be modular? That way, clinics could start with the basic unit and add components as they could afford them." Mr. Harrison's eyebrows rose with interest. "Go on." "Well, Dad and I were looking at the schematics earlier," Jamal continued, pulling the laptop closer. "See if we restructure the filtration system this way." His fingers flew over the keyboard, bringing up the designs they'd been studying. Sarah watched her son as he explained his ideas, his face animated with enthusiasm. She remembered all the parent-teacher conferences where they'd praised his potential, but always ended with the same sad reality. They couldn't provide the opportunities he deserved. Now, watching him discuss complex engineering concepts with one of the country's leading medical technology innovators, she felt tears welling up again. "You okay, honey?" David asked softly, noticing her emotion. She nodded, wiping her eyes. "More than okay. I'm so proud of both of you." She looked at her husband. "All those times you taught him to fix things, even after the accident when it would have been easier to give up. You never stopped believing in him. In us," David corrected gently. "We're a family. We do this together." Mr. Harrison cleared his throat, drawing their attention back. "I couldn't help overhearing," he said, "and that's exactly why I want you all involved in this new division. This isn't just about technical knowledge. It's about understanding the human side of what we do." He stood up, gathering his papers. "I should go. You all have a lot to process, and I'm sure your neighbors are dying to know what's happening." He smiled, glancing out at the growing crowd below. "But before I leave, I want to make something clear. This isn't charity. This isn't me trying to play savior. This is me recognizing talent, dedication, and the kind of wisdom that only comes from real-life experience." 1 month later, the Washington family stood in the gleaming lobby of Harrison Technologies, watching as Mr. Harrison unveiled the new division's sign, Community Innovation Lab. The space had been transformed into a unique combination of engineering laboratory and community center, with state-of-the-art equipment alongside practical repair stations. Jamal, dressed in a new suit that still felt slightly strange, stood between his parents. His father sat proudly in a new wheelchair. One of the first projects they'd tackled had been redesigning it for better comfort and mobility. Sarah wore her nurse's aide uniform. She'd insisted on coming straight from her shift, saying she wanted to represent the healthcare workers who would benefit from their work. "This lab," Mr. Harrison announced to the gathered crowd of engineers, investors, and community members, "represents a new direction for Harrison Technologies, one that combines cutting-edge innovation with real-world practicality." He gestured to the Washingtons. "And it wouldn't exist without this family's influence." The crowd applauded, and Jamal felt his face grow warm, but his embarrassment turned to surprise when he saw who was standing in the back of the room. Earl, the custodian he'd helped that first day, was there with his entire maintenance team. They were all smiling and giving him thumbs up. "In just 1 month," Mr. Harrison continued, "our new team has already revolutionized our safety harness design, developed a modular approach to medical equipment that could make advanced healthcare more accessible to underserved communities, and created a repair training program that will help other families maintain and fix their medical devices. David wheeled forward when Mr. Harrison beckoned, positioning himself next to the podium. "The accident that put me in this chair could have been the end of our story," he said, his voice strong and clear. "Instead, it became a beginning. Through my son's determination and Mr. Harrison's vision, we're now working to prevent other families from facing what we faced." Sarah stepped up next, still in her nurse's aide uniform. "Every day at the hospital, I see people struggling to afford the care and equipment they need. Now watching my husband and son work to change that." She paused, collecting herself. "Well, let's just say miracles don't always come the way you expect them." Finally, it was Jamal's turn to speak. He approached the podium, looking out at the faces before him. He saw Marcus, the driver who'd become a friend, standing with his brother from IT. Mrs. Chen was there too, having closed her store early to attend. Even some of his teachers had come. "A month ago," Jamal began, "I helped someone in a storm because it was the right thing to do. I didn't know it would lead to this. But my parents always taught me that when you see someone in need, you help them. When you see something broken, you try to fix it." He looked at his father, then at Mr. Harrison. "That's what we're doing here, trying to fix things on a bigger scale." After the ceremony, as people mingled and explored the new lab, Mr. Harrison pulled Jamal aside. "There's something else," he said, handing him an envelope. "Your MIT acceptance came through. Full scholarship as promised. But there's more." Inside the envelope was a proposal for a new program, one that would provide scholarships to other students from their neighborhood who showed promise in engineering and technology. "We're calling it the Carter Washington Initiative," Mr. Harrison explained. "Because good ideas deserve a chance no matter where they come from." Jamal looked around the lab that would become his second home, at his father consulting with engineers about their latest designs, at his mother talking with hospital administrators about implementing their new equipment. He thought about that stormy evening that had changed everything, about the simple decision to help someone in need. "You know," Mr. Harrison said softly, following his gaze, "James Carter used to say that the measure of a person isn't in how far they climb, but in how many people they bring up with them." He put a hand on Jamal's shoulder. "I think you understand that better than most." Outside the gleaming windows of Harrison Technologies, another storm was brewing. But this time, as Jamal watched the clouds gather, he didn't see danger or hardship. He saw possibility, chance, opportunity, just like the storm that had brought Mr. Harrison to their neighborhood. Sometimes, he realized, the darkest clouds really did have silver linings. You just had to be brave enough to walk through the rain to find them. "Ready to get back to work?" his father called from across the lab, waving him over to look at a new design. Jamal smiled, feeling the weight of the MIT acceptance letter in his pocket and the warmth of his mother's proud gaze. "Yeah, Dad," he replied. "I'm ready." And he was. Ready to learn, to build, to create. Ready to help others the way he'd been helped. Ready to prove that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest acts of kindness. Ready to show that even in the hardest neighborhoods, with the right support and opportunity, dreams could become reality. After all, storms didn't last forever. But what did you build in their aftermath that could change lives for generations to come? Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.